The wagon overturned on the third day of Grace Fletcher's journey west, crushing her uncle beneath its wheels and leaving her alone at 20 years old with nothing but the clothes on her back and the terrible certainty that she had killed another person she loved. Grace sat in the dirt beside the wreckage, her dark hair matted with dust and blood that was not her own, and counted the dead. Mother, during childbirth when Grace was 7. Father, from pneumonia when she was 12. Her older brother Thomas, thrown from a horse the day after Grace told him she worried something bad would happen. Her Aunt Martha, who took Grace in, dead from fever within 6 months. And now Uncle Henry, who had promised to take her to a new life in Montana Territory, gone in an instant when the wagon wheel hit a hidden rock on the rutted trail. She was still sitting there when the mountain man found her 2 hours later, the August sun of 1876 beating down on the grasslands of Montana Territory with relentless heat. Grace did not look up when she heard the horse approach. Perhaps death had finally come for her directly instead of taking everyone around her first. "Madam, are you hurt?" The voice was deep and rough, like gravel shifting in a river. Grace raised her eyes slowly. The man sat astride a massive bay horse, and he was easily the largest human being she had ever seen. Broad shoulders stretched the fabric of his worn buckskin shirt, and his arms were thick with muscle that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was weathered and tanned from constant exposure to the elements. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "I am cursed," Grace said flatly. "You should ride on before it touches you too." The man dismounted in one fluid motion despite his size, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He was even more imposing up close, standing well over 6 feet tall with the build of someone who could wrestle a bear and win. He approached the wagon carefully, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. "Your companion?" he asked, nodding toward the covered form beneath the wreckage. "My uncle." The wheel hit a rock. He fell. The wagon rolled over him. Grace's voice was mechanical, empty. "I told him we should have stayed in St. Louis. I told him." The man crouched beside the wagon, his powerful frame still managing to appear graceful despite his bulk. He examined the situation for a long moment, then stood and walked over to Grace. Up close, she could see the sharp intelligence in those blue eyes, the weathered lines around them that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. "Name's Pierce Rutherford," he said, extending a hand that was calloused and scarred and looked like it could crush stone. "I've got a cabin about 5 miles north. Can't leave you out here alone, madam. That would be unchristian of me." Grace stared at his hand but did not take it. "Did you not hear me? I am cursed. Everyone I love dies. Everyone who gets close to me dies. You should leave me here." Pierce studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her complete shock, he smiled. It transformed his entire face, softening the harsh lines and making him look younger than she had initially thought. He could not be much older than 30, she realized. "Well now, that's a heavy burden to carry all alone," he said, his voice gentle. "But I don't believe in curses, madam. I believe in bad luck and worse timing, but not curses. And I especially don't believe in leaving a woman stranded in the middle of nowhere with night coming on and wolves in these parts. So if you will not take my hand, I will have to ask you to stand on your own, because we have work to do before we can get you somewhere safe." Grace found herself standing without quite meaning to, responding to the quiet authority in his voice. "What work? Your uncle deserves a proper burial, and you deserve to not see him lying there like that for one more minute." Pierce's expression was kind but firm. "I have a shovel on my pack horse. Ground's hard, but I have dug in worse. You can say whatever words need saying, and then I am taking you somewhere you can have a hot meal and a safe place to sleep. And before you argue about your curse again, I will tell you right now that I am too stubborn to die. So whatever bad luck follows you around is going to have to try harder than it has been. There was something about the certainty in his voice that made Grace want to believe him, even though she knew better. She had spent 13 years watching people die, 13 years carrying the weight of their deaths on her soul. But she was also exhausted and grieving and alone, and this enormous man with the gentle eyes was offering her kindness that she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. "I do not have any money," Grace said quietly. "I cannot pay you." Pierce had already walked over to his horse and was untying a shovel from his pack. "Did I ask for money? Everyone wants something." He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Not everyone, madam. Some folks just do what is right because it is right." "Now, was your uncle a religious man?" Grace nodded, unable to speak around the sudden lump in her throat. "Then we will do this properly," Pierce said, and set about choosing a spot for the grave. Grace watched as Pierce worked, his powerful muscles flexing beneath his shirt as he drove the shovel into the hard Montana ground again and again. Sweat darkened his back, but he did not slow or complain. He worked with the steady, relentless pace of a man accustomed to difficult labor, and within an hour he had dug a grave deep enough to protect the body from scavengers. Getting Uncle Henry out from under the wagon required all of Pierce's considerable strength. Grace tried to help, but Pierce gently moved her aside and managed the task himself, his arms bulging with effort as he lifted the wagon enough to pull the body free. He wrapped Uncle Henry in a blanket from the wagon with surprising gentleness for such large hands, and then carefully lowered him into the grave. "You want to say something?" Pierce asked, removing his hat and holding it over his heart. Grace stood at the edge of the grave, looking down at the blanket-wrapped form of the last person in the world who had cared about her. The words would not come at first. Her throat was too tight, her chest too compressed with grief and guilt, and that terrible certainty that she had caused this just like she had caused all the others. "I am sorry," she finally whispered. "I am so sorry, Uncle Henry. You deserved better. You deserved better than me and my curse." Pierce said nothing, but she felt his presence beside her like a solid wall between her and the wind. When she had nothing else to say, he began speaking in a low, steady voice, reciting the 23rd Psalm from memory. His voice was beautiful, deep and rich, and full of a faith that Grace had lost years ago. They buried Uncle Henry as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. Pierce packed the dirt down carefully, then built a cairn of stones over the grave to mark it and protect it. Grace stood watching, feeling hollowed out and empty, like all her emotions had been buried along with her last remaining relative. "What was in the wagon?" Pierce asked when he had finished. "Anything you need," Grace shook her head. "Some clothes, a little food, my uncle's tools, nothing worth salvaging." Pierce glanced at the overturned wagon, then at the darkening sky. "We should head out now if we are going to make my cabin before full dark." "Can you ride?" "Behind you. I have got you." Pierce's voice was matter-of-fact, as if carrying strange women on his horse was something he did every day. "Come on now. I know you are tired, but we need to move." He was right. Grace was so tired she could barely stand, exhaustion and grief weighing down her limbs until every movement felt like wading through water. But she walked over to Pierce's massive horse and let him lift her up onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. His hands on her waist were gentle despite their obvious strength, and he settled her carefully before swinging up behind her. "Hold on," he said, and she grasped the saddle horn as his arms came around her to take the reins. She could feel the solid wall of his chest against her back, the heat of his body chasing away the chill that had settled into her bones despite the warm evening. They rode north as darkness fell across the prairie, Pierce guiding his horse with easy confidence even as the stars began to emerge overhead. Grace swayed in the saddle, barely conscious, held in place only by Pierce's arms on either side of her. She should have been frightened, alone in the wilderness with a strange man she had met only hours ago. But somehow she felt safer than she had in years, protected by this mountain of a man who had buried her uncle and asked for nothing in return. Nearly there, Pierce's voice rumbled in her ear after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all. "Stay awake just a little longer." Grace forced her eyes open and saw a small cabin nestled against the base of a pine-covered hillside, smoke rising from its stone chimney. A lean-to stable stood beside it, and she could see the dark shapes of at least 2 more horses moving in a small corral. It was a rough, simple place, but it looked like paradise to her exhausted eyes. Pierce dismounted and lifted her down from the horse with the same careful gentleness he had shown with everything else. "Can you stand?" Grace nodded, though her legs felt like water beneath her. Pierce kept one hand on her elbow as he led her to the cabin door and pushed it open, revealing a single large room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves lined with supplies and equipment. It was sparse but clean, the home of a man who lived alone but took pride in his space. "Sit," Pierce said, guiding her to one of the chairs. "I will get the fire built up and make you something to eat. Then you can sleep." Grace sank into the chair and watched as Pierce moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency. He built up the fire until warmth began to fill the room, then filled a pot with water from a barrel and hung it over the flames. He moved with the easy competence of someone completely comfortable in his solitude, and Grace found herself wondering how long he had lived out here alone, how a man like him ended up isolated in the Montana wilderness. "How long have you lived here?" she heard herself ask, her voice hoarse. Pierce glanced at her as he sliced salt pork into the pot. 5 years. Built this place myself after I came back from the war, needed quiet after all that noise and death. Were you a soldier, Union cavalry?" His voice was neutral, but Grace saw something flicker in his eyes. "Saw more than enough killing for one lifetime. Figured I would come out here and trap and hunt and bother no one but the wildlife." Grace watched as he added dried vegetables to the pot, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. "You not get lonely?" Pierce was quiet for a long moment, stirring the simple stew he was preparing. "Sometimes. But I've got my horses and I go into Helena every few months for supplies and to sell furs. It is enough most days." Helena. The town where Uncle Henry had been planning to take her, where he had said there was work to be found and a chance for a fresh start. Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the thought that they had been so close, that her curse had struck again, when safety was almost within reach. "Hey now," Pierce's voice was suddenly close, and Grace realized he had crossed the room while she was lost in her thoughts. He crouched in front of her chair, his blue eyes level with hers, his expression concerned. "You are safe here. I know today was terrible, but you are safe now. I promise you that." "You should not make promises to me," Grace whispered. "I will only bring you bad luck." Pierce reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he took one of her hands in both of his. His hands were enormous, rough with calluses, but impossibly gentle. "Listen to me, Grace Fletcher. I do not believe you are cursed. I believe you have had more than your share of sorrow, and I believe you have been carrying weight that no one person should have to carry. But that does not make you cursed. That makes you strong because you are still here, still standing after all of it. Grace stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. No one had ever called her strong. Unlucky, yes, cursed, certainly, but strong. She had never thought of herself that way, had only thought of herself as a survivor clinging to life while everyone around her fell away. "I am not strong," she said, her voice breaking. "I am just too afraid to die." "That is called survival," Pierce said firmly, "and there is no shame in it. You have survived things that would have broken most people. That is strength, whether you see it that way or not." He stood then, releasing her hand, and went back to tend to the stew. Grace sat in silence, turning his words over in her mind. Could it be true? Could she be strong instead of cursed? The idea seemed impossible, but Pierce had said it with such certainty, as if there was no doubt in his mind. When the stew was ready, Pierce ladled it into 2 wooden bowls and brought one to Grace along with a spoon and a thick slice of bread. "Eat. You will feel better with some food in you." Grace obeyed, and despite her grief and exhaustion, the hot food was like heaven. She could not remember the last time she had eaten a full meal, and she found herself devouring the simple stew as if it were a feast. Pierce ate his own portion in silence, watching the fire more than watching her, giving her space to collect herself. When they had finished eating, Pierce took their bowls and washed them in a bucket of water, then turned to face her with what looked like embarrassment on his weathered face. "Now, I only have the one bed, and I am not going to make you sleep on the floor after the day you have had. So I will take the floor tonight, and we will figure out something better tomorrow." Grace opened her mouth to protest, but Pierce held up one large hand. "No arguments. I have slept on much worse than a wooden floor, and you need proper rest. Come on, I will get you settled." He was immovable when he had made up his mind. Grace was learning. She followed him to the bed, which was just a simple frame with a rope mattress and blankets, but looked more inviting than anything she had ever seen. Pierce pulled back the blankets and stepped away. "There is a screen in the corner if you want privacy. I will be right over by the fire, and I am a light sleeper, so if you need anything in the night, just say so." "All right," Grace nodded, too tired to form words. She waited until Pierce had moved back to the fireplace and turned his back, then quickly removed her dusty, blood-stained dress and boots, leaving on her shift. She climbed into the bed and pulled the blankets up to her chin, and the softness of the mattress after days of sleeping in the wagon was almost enough to make her weep again. "Thank you," she said quietly into the darkness, "for everything." Pierce's voice came back to her, warm and steady. "You are welcome, Grace. Sleep now. Tomorrow will be better." Grace closed her eyes, exhausted beyond measure, but sleep would not come immediately. She lay in the darkness listening to Pierce moving around the cabin, hearing the rustle of blankets as he made himself a bed on the floor near the fireplace. She should have felt awkward, sleeping in a strange man's cabin, using his bed while he slept on the floor. But instead, she felt something she had not felt in years, protected. This man who owed her nothing, who had every reason to ride past a cursed woman sitting in the dirt, had instead stopped. He had buried her uncle with respect and gentleness. He had brought her to safety and fed her and given her his own bed. And he had looked her in the eye and called her strong. Grace did not believe she was strong. But maybe, just maybe, Pierce Rutherford was right about one thing. Maybe she was not cursed. Maybe she had just been unlucky, and maybe that luck was changing. She fell asleep with that thought warming her more than the blankets, the first tiny seed of hope she had allowed herself in 13 long years. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of someone moving around the cabin and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic flared in her chest. Then memory returned, everything from yesterday flooding back, and she sat up with her heart pounding. Pierce was at the fireplace, his back to her, his long hair still loose around his shoulders. He had changed into a clean shirt, and even from across the room, Grace could see the play of muscles beneath the fabric as he worked. Morning light streamed through the cabin's small windows, illuminating dust motes in golden shafts. "Morning," Pierce said without turning around. "There is water in the basin if you want to wash, and I left one of my shirts on the chair for you. Your dress is not really fit to wear anymore." Grace looked down and saw that he was right. Her dress, already worn and dusty from travel, was now stained with dirt and her uncle's blood. Tears pricked her eyes again, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough yesterday. "Thank you," she said, and climbed out of bed, self-conscious in just her shift even though Pierce was not looking at her. She moved behind the screen in the corner and found the basin of water Pierce had mentioned, along with a cloth and a cake of rough soap. She washed as best she could, the cold water shocking her fully awake, then reached for the shirt Pierce had left. It was enormous on her, hanging past her knees and with sleeves that covered her hands completely. But it was clean and soft from many washings, and it smelled like pine smoke and leather and something else that was uniquely Pierce. Grace rolled up the sleeves and emerged from behind the screen, feeling ridiculous but at least clean. Pierce turned when he heard her approach, and something flickered in his eyes when he saw her wearing his shirt, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Coffee, please." Grace sat at the table and accepted the tin cup he handed her. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was hot, and she wrapped her hands around the cup gratefully. Pierce sat across from her with his own coffee, and in the morning light, Grace could see him more clearly than she had the night before. He was perhaps 30 or 31, with a strong jaw beneath his beard and a straight nose that looked like it had been broken at least once. There was a scar above his left eyebrow and another along his right forearm, visible where his sleeves were rolled back. His eyes were that startling blue, intelligent and kind, framed by dark lashes that seemed almost feminine in contrast to the rest of his rugged features. He was, Grace realized with a start, handsome. More than handsome. He was beautiful in the way mountains were beautiful, all strength and power and natural majesty. "What are you staring at?" Pierce asked, but there was amusement in his voice rather than anger. Grace felt her face heat. "I apologize. I was just thinking that you are very large." Pierce laughed, a deep rumbling sound that filled the cabin. "That I am. My ma always said I got switched at birth with a bear cub. Speaking of mothers, do you have anyone we should send word to? Anyone who will be worried about you?" The question drove away any trace of lightness Grace had been feeling. "No, there is no one. My uncle was the last." Pierce nodded slowly, his expression serious again. "All right then. So the question becomes, what do you want to do now? Helena is about 15 miles from here. I can take you there, help you find work and a place to stay if that is what you want. Or, if you would prefer, you can stay here for a while until you figure out what you want to do. I will not claim I am good company, but you would be safe and warm and fed." Grace stared at him. "You would let me stay here, with you, but you do not know me." "I know enough," Pierce said simply. "I know you have been through hell and back. I know you need a place to catch your breath and grieve proper. And I know that if I send you off to Helena alone with no money and no one to watch out for you, I will spend the rest of my days wondering if you ended up safe or if something bad happened to you. So yes, you can stay here if you want, long as you need." Grace felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight for years. This man, This enormous, gentle mountain man was offering her sanctuary without expecting anything in return. It was so far outside her experience that she did not know how to respond. "I would just be a burden," she said finally. "I do not want to impose on your hospitality." Pierce shook his head. "Not a burden. Company, maybe. Someone to talk to besides my horses and the occasional elk, and if you wanted, you could help with cooking and such." "I am not much of a cook, as you might have noticed from that stew last night, but I am not asking you to work for your keep. I am offering you a safe place to land, Grace. That is all." Grace looked down at her coffee, her mind racing. The practical part of her said she should go to Helena, find work, start over somewhere no one knew about her curse. But the exhausted, grief-stricken part of her wanted nothing more than to stay in this quiet cabin with this gentle giant of a man who made her feel safe for the first time in years. "Could I stay for just a little while?" she asked quietly. "Just until I feel steady again. You can stay as long as you like," Pierce said firmly. "Now eat some breakfast and then I need to go check my trap lines. You can come with me if you want, get some fresh air, or you can stay here and rest. Either way is fine by me." Grace chose to go with him. The thought of sitting alone in the cabin with only her grief for company was unbearable, and despite everything, she found she wanted to be near Pierce. He made her feel anchored somehow, like his sheer physical presence was enough to keep her from floating away on her sorrow. They spent the morning walking Pierce's trap lines through the pine forests that covered the hillsides around his cabin. Pierce moved through the wilderness with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in it, pointing out animal tracks and teaching her to read the signs of the forest without even seeming to realize he was doing it. He spoke in that low, rumbling voice, never pushing her to respond, just filling the silence with gentle observations about the world around them. They found 2 rabbits in the traps, which Pierce dispatched quickly and humanely before resetting the snares. Grace watched him work with his massive hands, somehow managing delicate precision despite their size, and found herself marveling at the contradiction he presented. He was easily the largest, most physically powerful man she had ever encountered, and yet he moved with such gentleness, such care for everything around him. "You are staring again," Pierce said without looking up from the trap he was setting. "I am sorry," Grace said quickly. "I am just not used to people like you, people like me, kind people, strong people who use their strength gently." Pierce straightened and looked at her, his blue eyes serious. "Strength without gentleness is just violence, Grace. Any fool can hit hard. Takes a real man to know when not to." They walked back to the cabin in comfortable silence, and Grace found herself relaxing for the first time since the wagon accident. The morning sun was warm on her face, and the pine-scented air was clean and fresh after the dust of the trail. Birds sang in the trees, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the rush of running water. "Is there a stream nearby?" she asked. Pierce nodded. "About a quarter mile that way." He pointed east. "Good fishing if you like fish. And the water is cold and clean. Comes right down from the mountains." Back at the cabin, Pierce showed Grace where he kept his supplies and told her to help herself to anything she needed. Then he set about skinning and preparing the rabbits they had caught, his knife work quick and efficient. Grace watched for a moment, then moved to the shelves and began taking stock of what he had. The cabin was better supplied than she had expected. There was flour and cornmeal, dried beans and rice, coffee and tea, sugar and salt. Pierce clearly made regular trips to town for provisions. There were also herbs hanging from the rafters, dried and bundled, and when Grace examined them, she recognized many that her mother had used for cooking and medicine. "I could make biscuits for dinner," Grace offered. "If you would like. My mother taught me before she died." Pierce looked up from his work, surprise evident on his face. "I would like that very much. Been living on mostly meat and beans for years now. Biscuits sound like heaven." That evening, Grace made biscuits and Pierce cooked the rabbit in a skillet with wild onions and herbs, and they sat down to a meal that felt almost domestic in its normalcy. Pierce ate 4 of her biscuits and declared them the best thing he had tasted in 5 years, and Grace felt a small glow of pride that she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. After dinner, as they sat by the fire with fresh coffee, Pierce asked her about her family. It was the first time anyone had asked in years, and Grace found the words spilling out of her. She told him about her mother's death, about her father's slow decline into grief and illness, about her brother and her aunt and her uncle. She told him about the years of watching people die, about the growing certainty that she was cursed, about the way people had started to avoid her in St. Louis when they learned about her history. Pierce listened without interrupting, his eyes on the fire, his expression thoughtful. When she finally fell silent, he was quiet for a long moment. "That is a heavy load to carry," he said finally. "No wonder you believe you are cursed. But Grace, people die. It is the one thing we all have in common, rich or poor, good or bad. We all die eventually. Your ma died in childbirth, which happens every day to women all across this country. Your pa died of pneumonia, which is a cruel disease but a common one. Your brother died because horses are dangerous animals and accidents happen. Your aunt died of fever and your uncle died in a wagon accident. These are all terrible things, but they are also just things that happen in this world. They are not your fault." "But I knew," Grace whispered. "I always knew something bad was going to happen. I could feel it." "That is called anxiety, not prophecy," Pierce said gently. "You were a child who lost her mother, which would make anyone fearful of losing more people they loved. And then you did lose more people, which made the fear worse. But feeling afraid something bad will happen does not make the bad thing your fault when it does happen. Life is just hard sometimes, Grace. It is cruel and random and unfair, but that does not make you cursed." Grace wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she was not poison, not a harbinger of death for everyone who cared about her. But 13 years of grief and guilt were not easily swept away by kind words, no matter how much she wanted them to be true. "I do not know how to believe that," she said honestly. Pierce looked at her then, and his expression was impossibly gentle. "Then let me believe it for both of us until you can believe it yourself. Let me prove to you that you are not cursed. Let me show you that good things can happen to you too, that people can care about you without dying. Will you let me try?" Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks before she could stop them. "Why? Why would you do that for someone you just met?" Pierce reached across the space between them and very carefully, very gently, wiped the tears from her face with his thumb. His hand was rough and warm, and Grace found herself leaning into the touch without meaning to. "Because you need someone to," he said simply. "Because I know what it is like to carry weight that is too heavy for one person. Because the war taught me that life is short and precious, and we should help each other when we can. And because, Grace Fletcher, I think you are about the bravest person I have ever met, and you deserve to know that about yourself." Grace could not speak. She could only sit there with tears streaming down her face while this impossibly kind man looked at her like she was something precious instead of something poisonous. "Come on now," Pierce said gently, withdrawing his hand. "It has been a long day and you need rest. Go on to bed. I will bank the fire and settle in out here." Grace wanted to argue that he should have his bed, but she was too exhausted and too emotionally overwhelmed to push the issue. She retreated behind the screen and changed back into Pierce's shirt, then climbed into the bed that smelled like pine smoke and leather and safety. As she drifted off to sleep, She heard Pierce moving around the cabin, the sound of his footsteps solid and reassuring. For the first time in years, Grace Fletcher let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days began to develop a rhythm. Grace would wake to find Pierce already up and moving, and they would have coffee together before deciding on the day's activities. Sometimes they would check the trap lines together. Other times, Pierce would go out hunting or fishing while Grace cleaned the cabin and prepared meals. He brought her to the stream and showed her where to fish, and she discovered she had a knack for it, sitting patiently with the pole while Pierce worked nearby, splitting wood or repairing equipment. In the evenings, they would cook together and then sit by the fire, talking. Pierce told her about the war, about things he had seen and done that still haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. Grace told him more about her family, about the good times before the deaths started piling up, about her mother's garden and her father's laugh and her brother's terrible jokes. Pierce never pushed her to talk about her supposed curse, but he found small ways every day to challenge her belief in it. When they had good luck fishing, he would say, "See, you brought me luck today." When the weather was fine, he would tell her, "What a blessing to have sun on a day when I needed to work outside. Your presence must have brought it." When they prepared a particularly good meal, he would declare it the best food he had ever eaten and credit her presence for improving his life. At first, Grace thought he was making fun of her, but she quickly realized he was completely sincere. Pierce truly believed she was bringing good things into his life, not bad, and he told her so every single day. It was relentless, his determination to prove to her that she was a blessing instead of a curse. Slowly, so slowly she barely noticed it happening, Grace began to believe him. A week after her arrival, Pierce rode to Helena to buy supplies, and he said, to purchase some fabric so Grace could make herself some proper clothes. Grace had protested that he did not need to spend money on her, but he had just looked at her with those steady blue eyes and said, "You cannot wear my shirts forever, Grace, though I admit you look charming in them." It was the first time he had said anything that could be considered flirtatious, and Grace had felt her face heat with a blush that made him smile. He returned from Helena in the early evening with a pack horse loaded with supplies and several yards of calico fabric in a deep blue that matched her eyes. He also brought her a proper dress that he said a woman in town was selling, and a pair of boots that would fit her better than her worn-out ones. "You did not have to do all this," Grace said, overwhelmed by his generosity. "I wanted to," Pierce said simply. "Besides, I have been living like a hermit for 5 years. I have money saved and no one to spend it on. Let me do this, Grace. It makes me happy to see you have things you need." Grace tried on the dress behind the screen and found that it fit reasonably well, just a little loose in some places and a little tight in others. It was a simple brown cotton work dress, but it was clean and whole, and it made her feel more like herself than she had in days. When she emerged, Pierce looked up from where he was unloading supplies and went very still. His eyes moved over her slowly, and something in his expression made Grace's breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, and there was such sincerity in his voice that Grace felt her heart skip. "It is just a plain dress," she said, flustered. "It is not the dress," Pierce replied, his eyes still on her. "You would look beautiful in a flour sack, Grace Fletcher." The air between them felt suddenly charged with something Grace could not quite name. She had been aware, in an abstract way, that Pierce was an attractive man. But until this moment, she had not let herself think of him as anything other than her rescuer and host. Now, looking at him looking at her, she felt something shift inside her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, and Pierce nodded, then turned back to his supplies as if the moment had not happened. But something had changed. Grace felt it in the way she became aware of Pierce in a new way, noticing the grace with which he moved despite his size, the way his muscles flexed when he lifted heavy things, the sound of his laugh when she said something that amused him. She found herself watching him when he was not looking, memorizing the planes of his face, the way his hair fell across his shoulders, the gentle way he handled everything from horses to cooking pots. She realized with a jolt of fear and wonder, beginning to care for him. Not just as a friend or a rescuer, but as a man. It was a terrifying realization. Every person she had ever cared for had died. If she let herself love Pierce, would her curse take him too? But Pierce had said he did not believe in curses. He had said he was too stubborn to die. And every day, he proved to her that her presence brought good things into his life, not bad. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. The second week of Grace's stay at the cabin brought the first real test of Pierce's determination to prove she was not cursed. He went out hunting early one morning, promising to be back by midday with fresh meat for dinner. Grace spent the morning cleaning and baking bread, humming to herself as she worked, feeling more at peace than she had in years. But midday came and went with no sign of Pierce. Then afternoon stretched toward evening, and still he did not return. Grace stood at the cabin door, watching the tree line, her old fears rising up like a tide. This was it. This was the curse coming for him. He would be lying dead somewhere in the forest, killed by a bear or a fall or some other terrible accident, and it would be her fault for daring to care about him. Grace was nearly frantic by the time she heard the sound of Pierce's horse approaching. She ran out of the cabin and saw him riding slowly up the trail, slumped in his saddle. Terror seized her heart. Pierce! She ran to him as he dismounted and saw blood on his sleeve and his face drawn with pain. "I am all right," he said quickly, seeing her expression. "Just had a disagreement with a wounded elk. It is not as bad as it looks." But it was bad enough. The elk had gored him with its antlers, tearing a long gash down his left arm from shoulder to elbow. The wound was still bleeding despite the rough bandage he had tied around it, and Pierce's face was pale beneath his tan. Grace's medical knowledge was limited, but her mother had taught her basic care for wounds, and her aunt had expanded on that knowledge. She pushed down her panic and fell back on those lessons. "Inside," she ordered, and Pierce obeyed without argument, which told her he was hurt worse than he was letting on. Grace settled him at the table and carefully removed his shirt, trying not to notice the impressive expanse of his muscled chest and shoulders even as she focused on the wound. It was deep but clean, and thank God it had missed any major blood vessels. She heated water and gathered clean cloth, then set about cleaning and binding the wound properly. Pierce was stoic throughout, barely flinching even when she had to probe the wound to make sure there were no fragments of wood or dirt in it. But his jaw was clenched tight and sweat beaded on his forehead. "You should have been more careful," Grace said, her voice sharp with residual fear. Elk was suffering, had to put it down. It got one last strike in before it died. Pierce's voice was strained. "I am sorry I worried you. You are bleeding all over your cabin and you are apologizing for worrying me." Grace felt tears threaten and pushed them back angrily. "You could have been killed, but I was not." Pierce reached out with his good arm and caught her hand, stilling her frantic movements. "Grace, look at me." She looked up and his blue eyes were steady on hers. "I am not dead," he said firmly. "I am hurt, but I am going to be fine. This is not your curse. This is just life being dangerous sometimes. You understand me? But if I had not been here, if you had not gone hunting for extra meat because I was here eating your supplies, then I would have gone hunting eventually anyway, because I always do," Pierce interrupted. "And I would have ended up facing that elk just the same. Grace, You did not cause this. And more than that, you saved my life today by being here to help me. If I had been alone, I would have had to deal with this wound myself, and I might not have done as good a job. You see, you are a blessing, not a curse. Even when bad things happen, you make them better. Grace stared at him, and despite everything, despite her fear and her old beliefs, she found herself believing him. He was hurt, yes, but he was alive. And he was looking at her with such warmth, such certainty, that she could not hold onto her fear. "You are insufferable," she said, but her voice was gentle. Pierce smiled, and even pale and sweating with pain, it transformed his face. "I have been told that before." Grace finished bandaging his arm, then made him drink water mixed with willow bark tea to help with the pain and fever. She helped him to the bed, over his protests that he should take the floor as usual. And Pierce finally agreed to rest only when Grace promised she would wake him if she needed anything. She sat beside the bed long into the night, watching him sleep, checking periodically to make sure he was not feverish. His face was peaceful in sleep, younger and softer than when he was awake. Grace found herself reaching out to brush his hair back from his forehead, her touch gentle. "Please do not die," she whispered. "Please prove me wrong about everything. Please be all right." As if hearing her even in sleep, Pierce's hand found hers and held it loosely, and Grace sat there in the darkness, holding the hand of the man who had called her his blessing, and prayed to a God she was not sure existed that he would be proven right. Pierce ran a fever for 2 days, his body fighting the wound and the shock of blood loss. Grace barely slept, sitting beside him and changing his bandages, making him drink water and tea, bathing his face and chest when the fever made him burn. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes muttering things that did not make sense, words from the war mixing with present concerns. Grace learned more about Pierce in those fever dreams than he had told her in all their waking conversations. She learned he had lost friends in the war, men whose names he called out in his sleep. She learned he had nightmares about things he had done and seen. She learned that he had come to this mountain cabin to escape those memories, to find peace in solitude. She also learned, as he surfaced briefly into lucidity on the second night, that he cared for her more than he had admitted. "Grace," he whispered, his eyes opening to find her sitting beside the bed in the firelight. "Are you an angel?" "No, I am not an angel," Grace said gently, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "Just me." "Better than an angel," Pierce murmured, his fevered eyes trying to focus on her face. "Angels are not real. You are real. You are here." "I am here," Grace confirmed. "I am not going anywhere." "Good." "Cannot lose you, just found you." His hand found hers again, gripping with surprising strength despite his weakness. "You are my blessing, Grace. Best thing to happen to me in years. Do not let my stupidity with that elk drive you away." Grace felt her heart crack open completely. "I am not going anywhere," she repeated, and realized it was true. She could not leave this man now even if she wanted to. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, he had become essential to her, as necessary as breathing. "Promise," Pierce insisted, his eyes already closing again. "I promise," Grace whispered and pressed a kiss to his fevered forehead. On the 3rd day, Pierce's fever broke. He woke in the afternoon to find Grace dozing in the chair beside the bed, her hand still clasped in his. He watched her for a long moment, taking in her exhausted face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she had clearly not slept properly in days. "Grace," he said softly, and her eyes flew open. "Pierce, you are awake. How do you feel?" She was immediately alert, reaching out to touch his forehead, checking his bandage. "Weak as a kitten and hungry as a bear, but I think I will live." His voice was hoarse but clear, the fevered confusion gone. "Have you been sitting here the whole time?" Mostly. Grace looked embarrassed. I wanted to make sure you were all right. Pierce's expression went soft. You took care of me. Of course I did. You would have done the same for me. Yes, but I do not believe I am cursed and that everyone I care for dies. Pierce struggled to sit up and Grace helped him, propping pillows behind his back. Grace, I was hurt and fevered and irrational, and I am still here, still alive. Because you took care of me. You see now, you are not a curse. You are a blessing. You saved my life. Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks and she did not try to stop them. I was so afraid. I thought the curse had come for you. I thought I was going to watch you die like everyone else. But you did not, Pierce said firmly. He reached out with his good arm and pulled her gently toward him until she was sitting on the edge of the bed. I am right here, Grace, alive and getting better because of you. You need to let go of this belief that you are cursed. It is not true and it is keeping you from living your life. Grace looked at him through her tears, at his strong, honest face, at the certainty in his blue eyes. He had nearly died, and he was using it as proof that she was not cursed. It was absurd. It was wonderful. It was so perfectly Pierce that she found herself laughing even as she cried. You are insane, she said. Maybe, Pierce agreed and smiled. But I am also right. Say it, Grace. Say you are not cursed. I cannot. Try for me. Say you are not cursed. Grace took a shaky breath. I am not cursed. Again, like you mean it. I am not cursed. Her voice was stronger this time. One more time. I am not cursed. Grace said it loudly, almost defiantly, and felt something break loose in her chest. Years of guilt and fear cracking apart under the weight of Pierce's certainty. That is my girl, Pierce said softly, and the look in his eyes made Grace's breath catch. Without thinking, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was just a soft press of lips, gentle and brief, but it felt like the most important thing she had ever done. When she pulled back, Pierce was staring at her with such wonder on his face that Grace felt her heart skip. I should not have done that, she said quickly. You are injured and I am taking advantage. Pierce stopped her words by cupping her face with his good hand and pulling her back down for another kiss, this one longer and deeper. His lips were warm and gentle, and he kissed her like she was something precious, something to be cherished. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Pierce rested his forehead against hers. I have wanted to do that for days, he admitted. But I did not want to push you, did not want you to think I had brought you here expecting anything. But Grace, I care for you. More than I should after just a few weeks. You have brought light and life back into this cabin, into my life. You make me laugh. You make me happy. You are the best thing that has happened to me since before the war. Grace felt fresh tears on her cheeks, but these were different. These were tears of joy instead of grief. I care for you too. So much it terrifies me. I am afraid to love you because I am afraid of what my curse might do. There is no curse, Pierce said firmly. There is just life with all its risks and dangers, and yes, something could happen to me. I could get gored by another elk or fall off a cliff or catch pneumonia. But Grace, something could happen to you too. Life does not come with guarantees. All we can do is choose to live it fully, to love when we can, to take the happiness that comes our way. And you make me happy. You make me want to live fully instead of just hiding away from the world. Please do not let fear rob you of this. Rob us of this. Grace looked at him, at this impossibly kind, stubborn, wonderful man who had looked at her and seen a blessing instead of a curse. He was offering her everything she had thought she could never have: love, happiness, a future. And yes, it was terrifying. But staying locked in her fear was more terrifying still. Teach me, she whispered. Teach me how to not be afraid. Pierce smiled and kissed her again, soft and sweet. We will learn together. The next weeks passed in a haze of happiness that Grace had never experienced before. Pierce recovered quickly. his strong constitution and her careful nursing bringing him back to health faster than either of them expected. As he healed, the dynamic between them shifted and deepened. They still worked together, checking traps and fishing and maintaining the cabin. But now there were stolen kisses in the forest, hands held as they walked, arms around each other by the fire at night. Pierce courted her with quiet determination, bringing her wildflowers he found on his trap lines, teaching her to ride one of his horses, showing her the most beautiful spots in the mountains he called home. Grace bloomed under his attention like a flower finally given water after years of drought. She smiled more, laughed more, let herself be playful in ways she had forgotten she could be. Pierce delighted in her happiness, constantly finding new ways to make her laugh or smile. One evening, about a month after Grace had arrived at the cabin, they were sitting by the fire after dinner when Pierce cleared his throat nervously. "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. No worrying about my feelings or what you think I want to hear." Grace looked at him, suddenly worried. "All right. You want to stay here, with me? Or were you planning to move on to Helena once you felt steady again?" Pierce's voice was carefully neutral, but Grace could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his knees. Grace's heart began to pound. "What are you asking me, Pierce?" "I am asking if you can see a future here, with me. Because I can see one with you, Grace. I can see years of this, of us together, of building a life, but I will not hold you here if that is not what you want. If you want to go to Helena, start fresh somewhere with more people and more opportunities, I will take you there and help you get settled. I will not trap you here just because I have fallen in love with you." The words hung in the air between them. Fallen in love with you. Grace felt like she could not breathe. "You love me." Pierce turned to look at her fully, and his blue eyes were blazing with emotion. "I love you, Grace Fletcher. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you hum when you cook. I love how you are not afraid to get your hands dirty or to tell me when I am being foolish. I love waking up and seeing you first thing in the morning. I love falling asleep knowing you are safe under my roof. I love everything about you, and I have loved you almost from the moment I found you sitting in the dirt believing you were cursed." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling through them. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you so much. And yes, Pierce Rutherford, I want to stay here. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want everything with you." Pierce pulled her into his lap, mindful of his still healing arm, and kissed her until they were both breathless. When they broke apart, he was smiling wider than she had ever seen. "Then marry me," he said. "Let me make you my wife properly. We can ride to Helena tomorrow and find a preacher. Or we can wait if you want a proper courtship, though I warn you I am not a patient man when it comes to you." Grace laughed, giddy with happiness. "Tomorrow, let us go tomorrow. I do not want to wait either." That night, Pierce moved Grace's bedroll to join his own, and they slept wrapped in each other's arms for the first time, both of them too excited and happy to sleep much. They talked instead, making plans for their future, imagining the life they would build together. "I want to expand the cabin," Pierce said, his fingers trailing through Grace's hair. "Add another room, maybe two. We will need space for children if you want them." Grace's heart clenched at the casual way he said it, like it was a given that they would have a future, that children were a possibility to plan for instead of a curse to fear. "You want children with me. I want everything with you," Pierce said firmly. "Children, a bigger cabin, maybe a proper barn for the horses. I want to grow old with you, Grace. I want 50 years of this, of us, of building a life together in these mountains. What if my curse?" Pierce put a finger over her lips, gentle but firm. "There is no curse, say it." "There is no curse," Grace repeated obediently, and this time she almost believed it. "There is only us," Pierce continued. "You and me and the life we are going to build. Nothing is guaranteed, Grace. I could get kicked by a horse tomorrow, or you could slip on ice come winter. Life is dangerous. But that is why we grab happiness when we find it and hold on tight. And I am holding on to you, Grace Fletcher. I am never letting go." Grace kissed him then, pouring all her love and hope and fragile new faith in the future into it. Pierce responded in kind, his arms tightening around her, and they lost themselves in each other until the fire burned low and sleep finally claimed them. The next morning, they rode to Helena together, Pierce on his massive bay and Grace on the gentle mare he had been teaching her to ride. It was a beautiful day, the late September sun warm and the aspens beginning to turn gold in the valleys. Grace felt like she was floating, so happy she could barely contain it. Helena was a bustling mining town, crowded with prospectors and merchants, and all the chaos of a community built on hope and gold. Pierce navigated them through the muddy streets with easy confidence, clearly familiar with the town despite living so far from it. They found a preacher at the small white church on the edge of town, a kindly older man named Reverend Matthews, who looked delighted at the prospect of performing a wedding. He did not even blink at Grace's borrowed dress or Pierce's trail-worn clothes, just ushered them into his church and asked if they had rings. Pierce pulled 2 simple gold bands from his pocket, and Grace stared at them in shock. "When did you get those?" "Bought them the first time I went to Helena after you arrived," Pierce admitted, looking sheepish. "I knew then that I wanted to marry you. I was just waiting for you to realize you wanted it too." Grace laughed and cried at the same time, and Reverend Matthews chuckled and said that was the mark of a true bride. The ceremony was simple and sweet. They stood before the altar in the quiet church, sunlight streaming through the windows, and promised to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. Pierce's voice was strong and certain as he said his vows, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. Grace's voice shook with emotion, but she got through her vows without breaking down, though tears streamed freely down her cheeks. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them man and wife and told Pierce he could kiss his bride, Pierce swept Grace into his arms and kissed her so thoroughly that the Reverend had to clear his throat pointedly before they broke apart. "Sorry, Reverend," Pierce said, not sounding sorry at all. "I have been waiting for this moment for a long time." They signed the marriage certificate, and Pierce paid the Reverend generously. As they left the church, now husband and wife, Pierce pulled Grace close and whispered in her ear, "Hello, Mrs. Rutherford." Grace felt a thrill run through her at the words. She was married. She had a husband. She had a family again, one she had chosen and who had chosen her. It seemed impossible, miraculous. They spent the rest of the day in Helena, Pierce buying supplies they would need for the winter and Grace picking out fabric and thread to make clothes and curtains for their home. Pierce bought her a set of hairbrushes and a beautiful shawl, and when she protested the expense, he silenced her with a kiss and said, "I am allowed to spoil my wife." That night, they stayed in Helena's only hotel, a rough but clean establishment that catered to miners and trappers. Pierce carried Grace over the threshold of their room, both of them laughing, and set her down gently. "Are you happy?" he asked, suddenly serious. Grace reached up and cupped his bearded face in her hands. "I am happier than I ever thought I could be. You have given me everything, Pierce. A home, a future hope. You looked at me when I was broken and saw something worth loving. How could I be anything but happy?" Pierce kissed her then, tender and sweet, and they celebrated their marriage properly, learning each other with gentle touches and whispered words of love. Pierce was patient and careful, making sure Grace felt cherished and safe, and she fell asleep in his arms feeling more at peace than she had ever imagined possible. They returned to the cabin the next day, and life settled into a new rhythm. Grace threw herself into making their cabin into a proper home, sewing curtains for the windows and making a new quilt for their bed. Pierce started working on expanding the cabin as the weather began to cool, adding a second room that would eventually be a bedroom for future children. Winter came to the Montana mountains with fierce beauty, blanketing everything in snow and ice. Grace, who had worried about being trapped and isolated, found instead that she loved the forced intimacy of winter in the cabin. She and Pierce would spend long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from Pierce's small collection of books, or just talking and making plans. Pierce taught her to handle a rifle and to recognize animal tracks in the snow. Grace taught Pierce to cook more than just basic camp food, sharing her mother's recipes and experimenting with new ones. They worked together to keep the cabin warm and the animals fed, and Grace marveled at how natural it felt to build a life with this man. The first real test of Grace's faith in her new life came in January when a massive blizzard rolled through the mountains. The snow was so heavy and the wind so fierce that they could not even open the cabin door for 3 days. Supplies ran low, the cold seeped through even the thick log walls, and Grace found her old fears rising up. "What if we are trapped here?" she asked Pierce on the second night, watching the snow pile up against the windows. "What if we run out of food? What if—" "Then we will manage," Pierce said calmly, pulling her close. "We have enough wood for the fire, enough food to last another week if we are careful. The storm will pass, Grace. It always does, and we will be fine because we are together. But what if something happens to you? What if you get sick or hurt and I cannot get you to a doctor?" Pierce turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Grace, listen to me. You cannot live your whole life waiting for tragedy. Yes, bad things might happen. This is Montana territory in winter. Bad things happen to people all the time, but they also survive. We are going to survive. We are strong and smart, and we have each other. That is enough." Grace took a shaky breath and nodded. "I am sorry. I am trying not to be afraid all the time. I am trying to believe that good things can last." "I know you are," Pierce said gently, "and you are doing so well. But Grace, even if something did happen to me, even if the absolute worst came to pass, you would survive that too. You are stronger than you know. You have already survived so much. But nothing is going to happen to me, because I am stubborn and tough, and I love you too much to leave you alone." The storm did pass, just as Pierce had promised. On the 4th day, they woke to brilliant sunshine reflecting off snow so deep it reached the cabin windows. Pierce dug them out, his powerful frame making short work of the drifts, and they stood in the crystalline world outside their door, breathing in air so cold it burned their lungs. "See," Pierce said, wrapping an arm around Grace's waist. "We are fine. Better than fine. We are blessed." Grace leaned into him and smiled. "Yes, we are." Winter turned to spring and spring to summer. Grace marked her first anniversary of meeting Pierce in August by making his favorite meal and presenting him with news that made his eyes shine with tears of joy. She was expecting their first child. Pierce picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down and began fussing over her, asking if she felt all right, if she needed to sit down, if she should be doing less work around the cabin. Grace laughed at his worry and assured him she was perfectly healthy and perfectly capable of continuing their normal life for months yet. But Pierce was relentless in his care for her as her pregnancy progressed. He insisted on doing all the heavy work, would not let her chop wood or haul water, and constantly brought her little treats from the forest. Wild strawberries, interesting rocks, pretty feathers. He talked to her growing belly, telling their unborn child stories about the mountains and promising to teach them to ride and hunt and fish. Grace bloomed with the pregnancy, feeling healthier and happier than she had ever been. The cabin now had 2 additional rooms, and Pierce had built a beautiful cradle that sat beside their bed, waiting for its tiny occupant. Grace sewed clothes for the baby and prepared for the birth with a midwife from Helena, whom Pierce had hired to stay with them for the last month of Grace's pregnancy. In March of 1878, nearly 2 years after Grace had arrived in Montana Territory believing she was cursed, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Grace's old fears rose up, whispering that this was it. This was where her curse would strike. But Pierce stayed beside her the whole time, holding her hand, encouraging her, telling her she was strong and brave and that everything would be all right. And it was. Their son came into the world squalling and perfect, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. Pierce wept as he held him for the first time, this enormous mountain man reduced to tears by the tiny baby in his arms. "What should we name him?" Grace asked, exhausted but radiant. Pierce looked at her with such love it made her chest ache. "You choose." "You did all the hard work bringing him here." Grace thought for a moment, then smiled. "Thomas, for my brother, and his middle name should be Henry for my uncle." Pierce's eyes softened with understanding. "Thomas Henry Rutherford, it is perfect." They called him Tommy, and he became the center of their world. Pierce proved to be an extraordinarily devoted father, wearing the baby in a sling while he did chores, singing to him in his deep, rumbling voice, jumping up in the middle of the night to change him so Grace could rest. Grace watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love with him, if that was possible. On the day of Tommy's christening, when they rode to Helena to have Reverend Matthews bless their child, Grace looked around at the life she had built and felt a profound sense of peace. She had a husband who loved her, a healthy child, a warm home, and friends in the town who greeted her with genuine warmth. The curse she had believed in for 13 years had never existed. She had just been unlucky, and now her luck had turned. "What are you thinking about?" Pierce asked as they rode home, Tommy sleeping peacefully in Grace's arms. "I am thinking that you were right," Grace said softly. "About everything. I was not cursed. I was just afraid, but you taught me not to be afraid anymore. You taught me that I deserve good things, that I can have them without everything falling apart. You saved me, Pierce." Pierce reached over and took her hand, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "No, Grace, we saved each other. I was half alive up here, hiding from the world before you came along. You brought me back to life. You gave me purpose and love and now a family. You are the blessing, Grace. You always were." The years passed in contentment. Tommy grew into a sturdy, adventurous toddler with his father's fearlessness and his mother's quick mind. When he was 2, Grace became pregnant again, and this time she went through the pregnancy without fear, confident in her body and her future. Their daughter was born on a crisp October morning in 1880, an easy birth that left Grace tired but triumphant. They named her Martha Rose, for Grace's aunt and for the wild roses that grew around their cabin in summer. She had Grace's dark eyes and Pierce's strong features, and Pierce declared her the most beautiful baby ever born. Life in their mountain home was full and rich. Pierce continued to trap and hunt, and had also begun breeding horses, having discovered a talent for it. Grace kept the home, raised the children, and helped Pierce with the horses. They had expanded the cabin again, adding a proper bedroom for the children and a larger kitchen. They had friends in Helena who visited occasionally, and they made the trip to town several times a year for supplies and socializing. But their favorite times were still the quiet evenings at home, the four of them together by the fire. Pierce would tell the children stories about his adventures, exaggerating wildly to make them laugh. Grace would sing them to sleep with the songs her mother had sung to her. And when the children were finally asleep, Grace and Pierce would sit together, arms around each other, marveling at the life they had built. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Pierce took Grace on a picnic to a beautiful meadow high in the mountains, leaving the children with their friend Sarah from Helena. It was a warm September day, the aspens golden against the deep blue sky, and Grace felt like a young bride again, giddy with love. 5 years, Pierce said, pouring her a cup of cider from the jug they had brought. 5 years since I married the most stubborn, most beautiful, most cursed woman in Montana territory. Grace swatted at him, laughing. I was not cursed. No, you were not, Pierce agreed, suddenly serious. He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles. You were blessed, and you brought that blessing to me. Grace, these past 5 years have been the happiest of my life. You and the children, this life we have built, it is more than I ever dreamed I could have. Thank you for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who found you in the dirt and refused to let you believe you were anything less than wonderful. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you for being too stubborn to let me give up on myself. Thank you for proving every day that I was worthy of love. Thank you for giving me a family and a home and a future. I love you, Pierce Rutherford. I love you too, Grace Rutherford, more than words can say. They made love in that mountain meadow, under the golden aspens and the endless blue sky, and it was just as sweet and passionate as their first time together. Afterward, they lay in each other's arms, content and at peace. You ever think about that day I found you? Pierce asked, his fingers trailing lazy patterns on Grace's arm. About what might have happened if I had ridden past instead of stopping, Grace shuddered. I try not to. I was in such a dark place. I honestly do not know if I would have survived. You would have, Pierce said with certainty. You are a survivor, Grace. You always have been. But I am grateful every day that I stopped, that I got to be part of your life. You are my greatest blessing. And you are mine, Grace said softly. You and our children in this life. I never thought I could have this. I never thought I deserved it. But you taught me I was wrong. The years continued to pass, each one fuller and richer than the last. Tommy grew into a strong, capable boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and care for the horses. Martha was gentle and clever, more interested in books and plants than in horses, and Grace taught her to raid and to identify the medicinal herbs that grew in the mountains. In 1883, Grace gave birth to their 3rd child, another son they named Samuel Pierce. He was a quiet, observant baby who grew into a thoughtful child, content to sit and watch the world with serious eyes that missed nothing. Pierce had expanded their horse breeding operation, and they now sold horses to the Army and to ranchers throughout Montana territory. It provided a good income that allowed them to improve their home and save for the children's futures. Pierce had also become known in Helena as a man you could trust, and he was often called upon to track lost travelers or hunt dangerous animals. He always came home safe, joking that Grace's presence had made him invincible. On Tommy's 10th birthday in 1888, the whole family rode to Helena for a celebration. The town had grown substantially since Grace first arrived, and it now boasted proper shops and a school and even a small library. As they rode through the streets, Grace marveled at how far she had come from the broken, terrified woman who had sat in the dirt believing herself cursed. That evening, at the hotel where they were staying, Pierce pulled Grace onto the balcony overlooking the town. Below them, Helena glittered with lamplight, alive with the sounds of a growing community. "What are you thinking?" Grace asked, leaning into Pierce's solid warmth. "I am thinking about legacy," Pierce said thoughtfully. "About what we are leaving for our children. We have built a good life, Grace. A strong life. Our children are healthy and happy and loved. They know how to work hard and how to care for the land. They know what it means to be part of a family. That is a legacy worth leaving." Grace nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "They will never know what it is like to believe they are cursed. They will never know that kind of fear. Because you taught me I was not cursed, and I have taught them they are blessed." Pierce turned her to face him, his blue eyes still as clear and kind as they had been the day they met. There was silver in his beard now and lines around his eyes, but he was still her mountain man, still strong and protective and gentle. "You taught yourself, Grace. I just reminded you what you already were. But I am glad I was there to see you bloom. Watching you come back to life, watching you learn to trust in happiness, that has been one of the great privileges of my life." Grace reached up and pulled him down for a kiss, pouring 12 years of love and gratitude into it. When they broke apart, Pierce rested his forehead against hers. 12 years, he murmured. 12 years since I found you sitting in the dirt telling me you were cursed. Best day of my life finding you. Best day of mine too, Grace said softly, though I did not know it then. They stood on that balcony for a long time, watching the lights of Helena and holding each other, comfortable in the silence that came from years of understanding each other completely. The children grew and thrived. Tommy, at 15, was already as tall as his father and nearly as broad, working alongside Pierce on the horse ranch they had built. Martha, at 13, had become an accomplished herbalist and healer, her gentle nature drawing wounded animals and sick neighbors to her like a magnet. Samuel, at 10, showed signs of being a natural horseman, able to calm even the most skittish animals with his patient presence. In 1893, Helena officially became the capital of the state of Montana, no longer just a territory. Grace and Pierce attended the celebration with their children, now 17, 15, and 12, and Grace felt a swell of pride for the place that had become her home. That evening, after the celebrations had died down and the children were asleep in their hotel rooms, Grace and Pierce took a walk through the quiet streets. They held hands like young lovers, despite being in their 40s now, their love as strong as ever. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked suddenly. "Stopping for me that day, taking me in. Your life would have been simpler if you had ridden past." Pierce stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression incredulous. "Regret you? Grace, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me a family and a purpose, and a reason to be more than just a hermit hiding in the mountains. Every good thing in my life came from the moment I decided to stop and help a woman sitting in the dirt. I would make that choice 1,000 times over." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. Even after 17 years, he could still make her cry with his simple, honest declarations of love. "I would choose you too," she said softly. 1,000 times over. You saved my life, Pierce. You taught me how to live again. You proved every single day that I was not cursed, that I was worthy of love and happiness. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Pierce corrected gently, wiping her tears away with his thumbs. "That is what love is, Grace. Two people choosing each other every day, building something beautiful together. And we have built something beautiful, have we not?" Grace looked at her husband, at the life they had created, at the children sleeping upstairs who were healthy and happy and secure, and nodded. "We have built something wonderful." The years continued their steady march forward. Tommy married a local girl named Elizabeth in 1896 and started his own horse ranch with land Pierce helped him purchase. Martha met a doctor from Helena and married him in 1898, moving to town but visiting the mountain cabin frequently. Samuel, quieter than his siblings, seemed content to stay on the family ranch, working alongside his father and eventually taking over more and more of the daily operations as Pierce grew older. In 1900, Grace and Pierce celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with all 3 children, their spouses, and 4 grandchildren in attendance. They gathered at the mountain cabin, now substantially expanded from the simple one-room structure it had been when Grace first arrived, but still recognizably home. As Grace looked around at the family filling their home with laughter and love, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. All these people, all this love and life and happiness, had come from one moment of kindness on a dusty Montana trail. If Pierce had ridden past that day, none of this would exist. She would likely be long dead, her curse fulfilled in her own mind if not in reality, but Pierce had stopped. He had seen past her grief and fear to the woman beneath. He had refused to believe in her curse and had proven, day after day, year after year, that she was a blessing instead. That night, after the family had gone to sleep in various rooms throughout the expanded cabin, Grace and Pierce sat by the fire in the room that had been the entire cabin once. They held hands and watched the flames, comfortable in each other's presence as only people who had spent decades together could be. 25 years, Grace said softly. A quarter of a century. Best 25 years of my life, Pierce said immediately. And I plan on at least 25 more, Grace laughed. We will be ancient by then. I do not care. I want to grow ancient with you. I want to be 80 years old and still sitting by this fire, holding your hand, counting my blessings. And my greatest blessing will still be you, Grace. It will always be you. Grace leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him that time had mellowed but not diminished. You were right, you know. All those years ago when you told me I was not cursed, I fought you on it so hard, but you were right. I was not cursed. I was just waiting for you to find me. Pierce kissed the top of her head. We were waiting for each other. We just did not know it yet. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the Montana night was filled with the familiar sounds of their mountain home, the rustle of wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the soft sounds of horses in the corral. Pierce, Grace said finally. Yes, love, thank you for everything, for stopping that day, for refusing to believe I was cursed, for loving me so completely, for giving me this beautiful life. Thank you. Pierce pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Thank you for letting me love you, for trusting me enough to stay, for giving me a family and a home and a purpose, for proving every day that love can heal old wounds and create new joy. You are my blessing, Grace Rutherford. You always were, and you always will be. Grace looked up at him, at the face she had loved for 25 years, at the man who had seen her at her lowest point and had chosen to lift her up instead of walk away. And you are mine. They sat by the fire until it burned to embers, holding each other and counting their blessings. 2 souls who had found each other on a dusty trail and had built a lifetime of love from that one moment of grace. Grace had believed she was cursed, but Pierce had known better. He had seen the blessing in her from the first, and he had proven it daily for 25 years, and he would continue proving it for all the years they had left until the end of their days, when they would leave behind a legacy not of curse but of blessing, not of fear but of love. The mountain man and the woman who had believed herself cursed had instead created something beautiful together, a testament to the power of love to heal and transform and redeem. In the mountains of Montana, in a cabin built by hand and filled with love, Grace and Pierce Rutherford had found their happily ever after, and it was more blessed than either of them could have dreamed.